But what happens to your retirement when the unexpected happens? Retiring solo. And what you need to know on today's Get Ready for the Future show.
This is the Get Ready for the Future show.
And welcome in to the Get Ready for the Future show. My name is Scott Inman. Along with me is John Shrewsbury, and to his right, Teresa Arago, joining us for today's program. Welcome to both of you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
And we are glad to have you here for our discussion about retiring solo. Now, listen to these stats. Nearly a third of men and more than half of women over age 65 are widowed, divorced, or have never been married, according to a 2021 report from the U.S. Administration on Aging. There's no question that we in the client meeting rooms have had to go through the process of a client death, whether it's one spouse who is losing another spouse, or it's a single person, and then the next generation is what we're dealing with. But it is definitely something that, because of our experience, is keen on top of mind for us and has to be planned for a client's retirement.
Yeah, and I'm really almost taken aback at how this is one of the most ignored areas, or I say ignored, maybe not neglected intentionally, but people just don't want to think about not being with their spouse or their significant other on into retirement and things of that nature. And because of that, there's a lot of negative fallout that comes from that. A lot of people, where we see it show up the most, Scott, is when a couple, one is the dominant person in terms of money and finances. The other's very passive about it, lets that person take care of everything. Then the person who is dominant in the finances passes away, and that person who's left behind is really lost. And they are vulnerable. They are susceptible to scams and things of that nature. There's a lot there, I think, Teresa, that people have to be leery of and wary of and more prepared for. As a matter of fact, we talked about that in the book that Janet and I wrote not too long ago.
Yes, there's a whole chapter in there that talks about being prepared to be alone. And this is a conversation we have with couples. A lot of times they'll come in and one of them will say, well, I don't really deal with that. I don't need to be involved in the planning. And we go, whoa, whoa, whoa. Yeah. Yes, you do.
Yeah.
Because there's always a chance you could end up trying to manage this on your own. So you may not need to know all the details, but you do need to know what's going on so that you're prepared when it's your turn to take over.
Lots of places we're going to go with this today, but we're going to start on the show with a special guest. We are talking today on the Get Ready for the Future show with Carol Marock, who is an author of a book called Solo and Smart. And welcome to you, Carol. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, Scott and John and Teresa. It's so good to be here. It's a real honor to meet with you today and to talk about this really tough issue of aging alone.
Well, your book, Carol, was released this year, you told us, so it's relatively new on the shelves. But in the book, you talk about considering the top 10 concerns of older adults. Tell us what those are and why are they so crucial to understand?
Absolutely. Great question. I was a family caregiver, and out of that experience, once my parents died, I thought, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? Because I'm single. I don't have children. I have no one that will look out for me when I have issues like my parents did. So that really woke me up. And so I thought, well, where am I going to start? I knew that I had to put together a life plan. The research I did, it was all about money, saving money, finances, financial concerns about, retirement, which are all worthy topics. And finances, I think, is a central aspect to retirement. However, I looked at all the aspects that my parents faced and what I had to help them with. Well, they concerned health, housing, and where they lived, the location, transportation, finances, of course, matters, as well as social connections, having a faith community, having life purpose, and finding transportation. I think I might have mentioned having fun and engagement and finding support that's nearby, because if especially since I don't have children that will look out for me, nor do I have a spouse or partner. I knew that I needed nearby support, not only from professionals, but also from the local, friends and neighbors play a huge part in making sure that we're safe at home.
Carol, we've certainly faced a lot of uncertainty in the last few years. Obviously, COVID being right in the middle of that, but also changes in the world, the markets, things of that nature. And this leaves many retirees and pre-retirees feeling very worried about their future. Why is it important for people who are nearing retirement to shift their perspective from what will happen to what could happen?
It's so interesting because I even like focusing on those that aren't that close to retirement, but I call them pre-retirees because when I started looking at my plan, I was 55 and I thought I was too old. You really need to start looking at these things at 45. And when you really start evaluating and assessing your satisfaction with these top 10 domains, you have an opportunity to not only see where you are right now in terms of how well you're adapting to these top 10 domains, but also once you start researching and asking the right questions about these issues that you might face, it really opens up the door to what could happen. And because the more you learn about a specific health issue or maybe finding a ride, it really opens your mind to really creating ways that maybe you haven't thought about before. Because there are so many solutions that are either currently available or may not still be available. However, with your neighbors or your friends, you can create those yourself. Do you know what I mean? You can create your own kind of support system and to address some of the issues that your team, in terms of your support team, your neighbors, your friends, whoever are your peers, to help each other out.
A study from Northwestern Mutual shows that financial anxiety runs higher among singles, stating that 45% of single men and 50% of single women are stating that they have that struggle. That's a substantially higher percentage than married individuals. So it was 35% for married men and 41% for married women. How have you seen this impact singles as they're approaching retirement?
It's a huge concern. I think I have a Facebook group. It's called Elder Orphans, and there's about 10,000 members. And we have these discussions every day, and we talk about the fear that many of us face. And however, most of us are over the age of 55 in the group. I even have people that want to join at 45 and 40 because they realize I have a single child. They have a child, but they're divorced, and they estimate that they probably won't remarry. And they're worried. And I'm so happy that people are worried about it, because we have to start thinking about these issues straight ahead, because if we don't, some of the horrific stories that I read on my Facebook group, it's frightening because people haven't looked at some of these issues and they don't want to. And I think it was either Scott or John, I apologize, but said that they just kind of want to sweep it under the carpet and not think about it. Yes, that's true. However, there's no escaping aging. All of us will grow old, unfortunately. May not like it, but we will.
Well, and I think it's wonderful how you mentioned, we always say the solution to fear is education. So
Absolutely.
I feel like that's really what you're trying to encourage people to do, is educate themselves before they face the challenge so they're ready for it when it hits.
And Scott, I'm actually realizing every day that you can't escape aging.
I feel you on that. No question about it.
Yeah, definitely so.
Carol Marak is our guest today on the Get Ready for the Future show. She has a new book called Solo and Smart. Let's kind of reverse that. When you talked about people who are joining at a younger age because they are currently single and they're thinking that they may live the rest of their life that way. What about the person that needs to consider things if they are married, but they may find themselves experiencing retirement solo because of unforeseen circumstances?
Yes, as a matter of fact, in the U.S. Census, I just read a data point of the 2020 U.S. Census that the average, let's see if I can state this right, that the first time a woman becomes a widow is age 59.5 years old.
Oh, wow.
59 years old is the first time, and I believe, and I'm sorry, I don't have that figure in my head right now, but it's really a high number. It's either 60 or 80% of the women who become widows are at 59 years old for the first marriage. The second marriage, then it's 60 years old. To me, that's astonishing that, like you say, we don't want to think about losing our spouse, like we don't want to think about losing our children. However, it's a pretty high statistic that that we're facing here, and the likelihood that we will live without our spouse. I don't like putting fear in people. However, just be prepared for it. Just know the chances are pretty high that you will be without your spouse.
Carol, when we do financial planning for retirees, one of the hot topics, one of the things that we dig into the most is how to optimize Social Security. And there's some complexity there with a husband and wife and how much assets they have to bridge maybe delaying Social Security and things of that nature. How does all of that change when you're talking about a single retiree?
Well, I have some major gripes about how single people are extra burdened when it comes to, paying taxes and income taxes. So I won't delve into that. But it is an extra burden because I have friends who are married and they consider themselves solo agers, and I can understand that because they don't have children to help them out. However, they have the more financial means than a single person or a person who's been single most of his or her life, because we've had to rely on just our income for everything, right? For all our bills and expenses. However, single people, married couples, I think or partnered people have an advantage. If don't you think? Don't you think, John, that's true?
I do. Obviously, you've got the benefit potentially of dual incomes, dual Social Securities. One of the things that we talk to retirees about is that we're actually more okay with a retiree taking Social Security maybe early in their life as opposed to delaying later because they don't have a spouse to think about for that spousal benefit. And so there's some advantages there that they can go ahead and claim Social Security a little bit earlier if they're solo as opposed to a married situation.
And if they're widowed, you have the option of a widow's benefit after age 60, and that can sometimes allow you to delay your personal benefit. So those are some strategies that we talk about with people for sure. What would you say is the key difference between aging well and living well?
I don't think there is a difference between aging well and living well. I think to me, it's one and the same. I'm living alone and I'm living well. However, I'm also aging at the same time, which will automatically put me in the category that I'm aging well because I'm living well. I'm taking good care of myself. I have supported myself financially very well. I'm put myself in a position where I can take care of myself, and my health is great. I think that's why, as early as possible, I really encourage people to evaluate their top 10 domains and get a good handle as soon as possible on where they are right now and where they need to make improvements and start working on it if they're failing in certain areas.
Carol?
So that they can age well.
Carol, before we let you go today, I want to give you a chance to tell us where folks can buy your book. And then I also know you engage on social media. So how can people keep up with you?
Well, thank you. I appreciate that, Scott. My book, here it is. It can be found on Amazon. And you can also go to my website because I feature the book there. I talk in great detail about it. It's Carol Marock, and that's CarolMarak.com. And the book is on Amazon. Thank you. And if anyone or viewers have a question, please reach out to me via my website.
And I will say, too, I was able to easily find information by just Googling solo and smart. So if you're wanting to get some resources, it's really easy to find.
All right. Well, Carol, we thank you very much for joining us today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Carol.
That's Carol Marock, the author of Solo and Smart, joining us on today's Get Ready for the Future show, talking about retiring solo. And her book talks about, really, I like those 10 things she talked about, the 10 considerations to think about as an older adult. And there's a lot of different places that we can go here, guys, because I do think there's a clear difference in someone who's lived most of, if not all of, their life single and how they view retirement, as opposed to a couple that goes in expecting to have a long retirement with each other and then being faced with the unforeseen circumstances. I do find it interesting that we talk about the risks to your retirement all the time, and one of them is longevity risk.
Yes.
This is really the I was about to say opposite. It's not really the opposite, but it's a different, right? Because one, in this case, we're still talking about longevity risk for the surviving spouse, but in many cases, we plan out in general, unless there are overriding health concerns, to age 90 for both spouses. But in many cases, I was really taken back by what she said, that the average age of a first-time widow was 59 and some, 59.4 years old. It is a reality that as we've all pointed out, most people don't want to think about.
Yeah, and I think that, from a pure financial consideration, one of the things that you think about when you lose a spouse in retirement, you're going to lose a Social Security check. Now, obviously, the larger check stays with the surviving spouse. Essentially, that's Social Security will tell you that's not exactly how it works, but numerically, that's
mathematically, that's where you end up.
Yeah, that's where you end up. And so you've got that type of situation that you've got to think through, and so you can't obligate yourself with all of your income, because if someone passes away, that smaller check is going away. Also, you could have a situation where, depending on if you have a pension and you've made a decision to have a life-only pension, then if that person who is the pensioner dies, then that pension dies with them. And so those are two really big things that I think a lot of people think about in terms of what are the dangers that you face in retirement in losing a spouse.
And I think that's one thing that we do shine a light on really well for people, is that you can't think of your financial pieces as separate. It's all one big puzzle. That pension has a part. Social Security has a part, but they're all part of one greater puzzle. So you've got to think of them together. And I think separating them, what I love about her book and what we're talking about, is you can't separate all these and have a solid foundation for your retirement.
Yeah. So when you look at that bigger picture, that puzzle, when it's put together, it's really all about income. It is the continuing flow of retirement income, uninterrupted, even in the event of a spouse's death.
Yeah, because you have to have that margin. If that spouse passes away and your income is impaired because of that, and it certainly will to at least the extent of Social Security, then if you've got all of your income obligated to pay bills, then you've got a problem. You've got to have that margin, that space, if you will, between what you bring in and what you spend, so that in the event that there is a death, then you're not really trying to make some real serious decisions at a really bad time in your life.
Yeah, and you think about, one of the things I think about when we say income uninterrupted, a lot of times you'll say, okay, but if there's only one of us instead of two of us, the income need is going to be reduced. And to some degree, that is correct, but it's not cut
It's
in
not
half.
No, because your electricity bill is not going to be cut in half just because there's one less person.
And if you have a mortgage, it's not going to go away. They don't care if one one person or 50 people are living in the house, it doesn't matter. The mortgage is still going to be the same.
Yes, I think medical expenses is the biggest impact. I think if
Yeah.
they were having medical challenges, you might find that does make a greater impact. But aside from that, everything else, it's more like a third less
Yeah.
at best.
Yeah. And then the other portion of this conversation, too, and this is not really necessarily, I guess the end game would still be retiring solo, but the long-term care component of this, right? If one or both spouses needs care, but in a surviving spouse scenario where one spouse before they pass away has a long-term care need, that's part of this equation too.
Yeah, because there's not anyone there to render care to you.
Yep.
And you've got to think about, okay, I'm probably going to need some sort of paid care, because if there's no one there and you can't take care of yourself, then you're really up against it when it comes to that from a financial standpoint.
And there's statistics that we learned during our RICP training that stated that people will avoid care because they don't want to affect the next generation. And I hate to hear that. And that's made me even more keenly aware of watching out for that long-term care piece with my clients.
Yeah.
But I mean, the statistics are a little scary. I will say, like, when I read through them in prep for this show, it said that according to the U.S. Census Bureau, there are more than 20 million unmarried U.S. residents aged 65 and older. And a Pew Research paper estimates that 27% of adults 60 and older live alone.
Yeah, and that's has lots of consequences to it, and so obviously it drives the planning question, Scott. And number one, are you planning? A lot of people, just as we said in our interview with Carol, a lot of people just stick their head in the sand and kind of whistle in the dark and hope it doesn't affect them in any dramatic way. But I think that's really foolhardy, because we can't avoid what's going to happen to us down the road.
Yeah. So the first part of this piece is, as we start to kind of wrap up the show today about retiring solo, it still comes back, as John, you just mentioned, the planning process. So we referenced this earlier in the show about oftentimes one spouse is way more locked into financial matters than the other. Most often, in my experience, I think it would probably be yours too, that it's probably the male, but it's not always, but most of the time it is the male that's kind of in charge of the finances, knows what's going on, not necessarily controlling spending, but controlling where things are, right? Where the retirement
Casting the
funds
vision,
are.
maybe.
Casting the vision, coming in with the idea of what we need to do and understands more from a financial side, and the other spouse does not.
Yeah, and let's dig into this for just a second. If you think about it, statistics show that males usually predecease the female.
Yep.
And for the female to be the passive one in that relationship as far as finances are concerned really is kind of setting them up for disaster in the future, because if they don't know an awful lot about the finances and then they're left with all of it, then that's a really hard thing to do, especially as you get older.
I think the key is to the time. I have a client whose husband was primarily the financial mind, and he did pass away in this past year, and it's just added stress. She felt like she was prepared because they had had some conversations, but then there were pieces that snuck up on her. And I just hate to see that additional stress fall to her. So it's been really, it's so important to make sure you've got your Honey, I Love You file together. We've talked about that before. Make sure that your spouse knows all the passwords, all the usernames, so they can get the information they need and have all your ducks in a row.
I have a client who came in just yesterday, and he brought it in to show us. He calls it the book. He's got a lot of stuff going on in his life, but he's got a book.
Yeah.
And all of his information on his Gen Wealth accounts, who his advisors are here, and all of that type of thing was all in there. But there was also lots of other stuff in there. All of his passwords to all of the websites that he uses and what have you are all in there. It was probably one of the more prepared people that I've seen to be sure that things were okay when they are called away.
Yeah. And I think it's important, too, to point out that when we see the couples come in and that's the situation that one is more locked into the finances than the other, that's probably a reason that they have made it to retirement as a married couple, because I think it works well in life, right? Because
Yes.
most divorces happen because of money.
Butting
That's
heads over that.
Yeah, butting heads over money. So it's great that one person has kind of you've been able to work that out in marriage, but when it comes to retirement, the game is changing, and I think that's great what you said about your client. We also we met with a couple yesterday, in fact, where there's a significant age difference. The male is 60 years old, and the wife is 53, so about a 7-year difference, and he has already chosen a straight life pension for his retirement and is receiving it. So too late to do anything about that, but now the planning process is, and that's when we came out of the meeting room, I talked to Mark and I said that's our number one goal right there is when what happens,
what's going to happen,
because it's likely statistically that the man in that relationship is going to pass away before the female, and she may live a very long life without a pension. So our goal there is to find a way with their assets to replace that pension when the day comes.
Yeah, because there is a strategy of using life insurance to replace that pension, but you got to be able to qualify.
Right.
And the older you are, and if you are an active receiver of a pension benefit, you're probably at least 60 or 65 years old. That makes it really problematical to actually have that life insurance in place to allow you to draw that higher benefit on the pension, but still leave something for your spouse.
Yeah, and that's a great consideration if they're constrained on the asset side, right? Because you could use that non-taxable death benefit to supplement the pension when it's gone. But if you've quote unquote overfunded retirement, and that's a phrase that we've become accustomed to using. I don't know that anybody really sees themselves as overfunding retirement, but when you bring our walk through the planning process here, the ready to retire process at Gen Wealth, we're going to walk through the income needs and the income wants and develop a monthly income plan for you in retirement. If your assets will more than support that income plan, there are opportunities to set aside assets for other reasons. For instance, replacing a pension in the possibility of a death.
Yes, and if you're solo, there's a few things that are also uniquely important. It's important in general, but especially if you're solo. We talked about making sure that you've got the health care worked out, but also estate planning.
Yeah.
What happens to all of your assets, all of your things? How do you create parameters for your assets and things when you're no longer here?
And I think you've got to think about the fact that you've got things to deal with in the estate planning realm. You've got things to talk about in terms of the income planning realm. There's just a lot here. And then the psychological part of going through life alone, especially if you've lost your spouse. Oftentimes older people who lose a spouse get very isolated, and those things can really hasten the impairment of the person's cognitive ability.
Yeah.
And then you've got a real disaster on your hands if nobody is there to try to help you with that.
Yeah, and I like what Carol talked about. She said she was single, doesn't have kids, doesn't have anybody around her for a support system. She has to consider the community and consider the faith community and consider where she's going to get her support from. And that's something I definitely think someone who enters retirement married is not really thinking about. Not only do they not want to think about losing their spouse, but they don't want to think about who would be there for them if they do. And that goes kind of to another point when you build out the estate planning topic, is the medical and financial power of attorneys. Because typically, if you have built a trust as a married couple, you're probably going to have your spouse fill one or both of those roles. But if that spouse is no longer there and then you move on single, that is certainly something that's going to need to be updated on the estate planning side.
Yes, and even if you have kids, they may not live locally.
Yeah.
So, a lot of families, their children are moving off, statistically at least. So if you don't have a child nearby, planning ahead to have somebody who's local that could fill that role is really important.
Scott, just because we call it financial independence doesn't mean you have to go it alone. And here at Gen Wealth, we've got, I was just reading an article just a few minutes ago about how effective checklists are in financial planning. And so the Ready to Retire process is simply a checklist. And so let's walk through, what all this means, because there are 7 key areas of financial planning that you want to try to deal with, especially if you're approaching retirement and thinking about the whole idea of living alone. Number 1 is you've got to create a written plan. Number 2, you've got to maximize your Social Security. Now, maximizing Social Security doesn't necessarily mean getting the biggest check, although it might, but it is maximizing its use in your overall financial plan. thirdly, you've got to consider what is called a hybrid retirement. Maybe because you are facing life alone, maybe work is a more important part of your life because of the socialization that work affords you, plus the income, and then thereby taking the strain off of your retirement assets for a period of time. That could allow you to live in a very nice lifestyle in retirement if you don't have to live on those assets for an extended period of time because you're working. The other thing that you've got to think about is inflation. We're seeing the effects of that right now, especially on the elderly. And you've got a secure guaranteed lifetime income. That lifetime income that basically pays your bills for you, that you know that those bills are going to be paid. So that gives you some freedom to do some things in retirement, to be able to get out and socialize and do the things that you're interested in doing, and know that your regular predictable income is coming in to pay those regular predictable expenses. And then the last couple of things there is to prepare for long-term care and also to defend against rising taxes. That's a concern for a lot of people. There is very competent tax planning that can be applied, especially in retirement. So I think the important thing is to seek qualified help in that, and that's what we do here at Gen Wealth.
Yeah, I want to go back to one you mentioned there, the considering a hybrid retirement. We think about that for couples so often, but if you are, you think about someone retiring as a couple, but winding up being in retirement solo because of the loss of a spouse, if they don't have a written plan, if they don't work with a financial advisor, and all they have is a pile of assets invested in some way they don't really understand, they're going to be really tempted psychologically to think, I've got to go back to work. I can't touch this because I've got to create income for myself, and I don't know how all that stuff works. You think about having a written plan for that maybe you don't have to go back at all, or maybe you do need to have some supplemental income, but your assets will help support your retirement income.
And I think working because you want to is very different from working because you have to.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that the whole aspect of work into retirement is really evolving these days, but more so with the single person. I can't emphasize enough the socialization, the mental involvement in work, and keeping you sharp when you could be just sitting at home staring at the four walls and dealing with the silence of being alone. Work is something that is very, very beneficial. Work doesn't have to be a four-letter word, although it is. It doesn't have to be. It can be very beneficial for you in a lot of different ways. And so I would just encourage folks to think about that as they think about this whole idea of facing life solo in retirement or even before retirement.
Well, that is the final bell that you hear in the background there. We think. I didn't hear it, but I know that it's time for it.
You're hearing things, Scott.
We're going to call for it.
Ding, ding. There you go.
There you go.
We're going to check your cognitive abilities.
That means, yeah, you probably should do that anyway. Okay, so it's time for our final thoughts. Teresa, we'll start with you.
Your opportunities are endless. The reality is, whether you've planned to retire solo or you're finding yourself doing this outside of your original plans, your future is full of opportunity. So you deserve a plan that helps set you up for success in your future, and starting now is the time to get going on that.
I would say that don't let the future sneak up on you. I know that you could be listening to this show and go, well, that's not me. That's not going to happen to me. Don't think that way. I think fortune favors the prepared. If you're prepared and it doesn't happen, okay, you spend a little time preparing and you didn't need it. But if it happens to you and you're not prepared, then again, you've got a disaster on your hands. Here at Gen Wealth, we specialize in helping people get to and through retirement, regardless of whatever life may be dealing you and whatever situation you may be facing. So I would just say that picking up the phone and getting a plan started is a great way to really come to grips with some of these issues that we've been talking about today.
Yeah, we talked about retiring on your own terms at the start of the show, but it doesn't always work that way. There are lots of things that are out of our control, and you need to have a plan for those unexpected things in retirement. You can start the road to the retirement you dream of by taking the first step for free. My final thought is for you to visit 15minuteretirement.com. That's 15 and then minuteretirement.com, or text the word checkup to 501-381-5228 to get your free assessment. And that's all the time we have for this week's show. We thank you for being with us on Retiring Solo. What happens when the unexpected happens in retirement? Our thanks again to Carol Marak, our special guest, the author of Solo and Smart, and we'll talk to you again next week.